Now when you do this, you might decide that maybe I don't like this sky, I want to use a different sky. Well, all you have to do is just find back the images of the skies that you have. So in this case, let's try this sky here. All right, so what do? Well, I just need to drag it into Photoshop. Let's use that method again, and voila. Now, of course, it's behind here because if you look, I actually have this layer behind my downtown layer. And I'm going to choose yes to commit that. All right, great. So now I just need to adjust this sky. I'm going to use this here. And, you know, I'm kind of liking this sky. This sky is pretty nice. It's pretty nice. All right, good. But you can choose any sky that you would like. Now, what we want to do next is we want to put the car in. So we need to go to the folder that has the vehicles. So here we go. Now you can pick any one of these vehicles. I think this one will work best. So I mean, actually any one of these could work, but I'm gonna use let's use the buggy. So again, I'm gonna drag this in. There it is. Of course, it comes behind my downtown layer. I want it to be on top, so I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna drag it on top. I'm gonna switch it off for now. Let's get a little organized here. I had two skies, so I'm gonna call this sky Sky 2. There we go. So I have Sky 1 and Sky 2. I can actually just swap them out when I'm ready. Alright, that might be something you might like. Alright, let's look on this car that we have here. Now you have to make sure that I'm actually on the car layer, so I'm going to select the car there. Now the first thing is that the car layer it does not have a transparent background. It has this white background, so we need to get rid of it. And we know how to do that already because we remember the lasso tools that we used on the city. All right, now before we can start manipulating this layer, we know that, oops, Photoshop will take this as a smart layer. And we know that we can't edit smart layers, but let's spend some time and talk about that a bit. You know, why would Photoshop, like, when you insert a new object, it would make it into a smart layer? A layer that you can't edit. Well, just to give you a quick example, right? I'm gonna drag in the other vehicle. So let's, for example, I'm gonna drag this other vehicle in like that. There we go. And I'm gonna commit that, and you can see that this now has a new layer. Now, if I make this really small, and I know that it's small, if I zoom in, I'm using the control and mouse wheel to zoom in here. That's pretty small, and if you look at it, you say, oh well, it even looks like the quality is kind of lost there because, you know, this one was way sharper. Now, of course, I can just resize it like that and choose commit, and no problem. Right, it's now sharp again. Now it's sharp because as a smart object, Photoshop preserves all of the data within this image. Now let's say it was not a smart image, a smart layer. So remember how to convert a layer to a regular layer. You're going to right click it and choose rasterize layer. Alright, great. No difference here. However, if I make this small, once I commit and I say, oops, I don't want it to be small, let me make it large again. It was a bit larger, and I commit. Then you might notice that it's way more blurry, and the reason for that is when you made it small, you totally squashed the pixels. I mean, think about how the pixels work, right? Remember, when you zoom in, you can actually eventually see the pixels, right? So let me just kind of zoom out a little bit. Right, so remember, when you zoom in, you actually see the pixels here. And what happens when you make something smaller, you are forcing the pixels into a smaller amount of pixel density. So before, when the image was much larger, the pixels that made up the tire, for example, this area, was that amount of pixels. But when you made the image smaller, all of this now has to fit in a smaller size. But guess what? The size of the squares doesn't change. So what does that mean? These squares are going to have to store more information in them, and the squares aren't getting any smaller. So what is essentially happening is you are crushing the image and losing detail, because when you enlarge the image, you would have already lost those that detail in those pixels. Alright, so now that that example is out of the way, let me zoom out a bit. We're going to get rid of this car here, and now we kind of understand why Photoshop uses this smart layer by default, because it doesn't want you to change the size of the image and rotate it and do all sorts of things to it and lose detail. So you have to specifically say, okay, Photoshop, I want to rasterize. Once you do that, you know you have to be very careful, because when you change anything, you're not going to get it back. But in order to change something, in order to cut out an object, you have to rasterize it first before you are able to cut stuff out. Now, we're going to try out another tool here. We could use the polygonal lasso tool, our favorite tool, but because of the nature of this car, because it's on a white background, we're going to try another tool. So we're going to try the quick selection tool. Now the quick selection tool is actually a sub tool of the magic one. So remember, once you see this little triangular element here, you're going to click and hold, release, and then you're going to choose the quick selection tool. That's here. Now how does this tool work? Well, the quick selection tool, what I'm going to do is select this white area and drag, and notice I'm clicking and holding and dragging, and the quick selection tool is actually finding all these edges for me automatically, and it's actually going ahead and finding them. So you might say, oh, why didn't we use this tool all along? Look at that, even before I reach the end, it has already selected just the white areas. Now, in case it did not select all your white areas, for example, notice that on the top of my car here, I'm going to pan over a little bit by holding the space bar, it has accidentally selected some of the red. So if I delete now, then naturally it's going to actually delete that part of the car, which we don't want. So I'm going to undo that. So what we have to do is deselect this area here. Now to deselect, you're going to hold, and I want to watch to show you this. If I hold Alt notice that the symbol changes to a minus. If I release Alt, the symbol is a plus. So what you want to do is you want to hold Alt and you want to select the sections that you want to keep. So I'm going to click on hold and drag, and notice that the quick selection is trying to snap to these edges. There we go. I'm going to pan over some more, and I'm going to hold Alt again and add this selection here. So this is another method that you can use to highlight and cut stuff out. You can use the quick selection tool, and in this case it works fine, but if we try to use it on shapes that are a bit random or shapes where the colors are very close, it's not going to work. Alright, so I'm holding Alt and mouse wheel to zoom out. Alright, so let me zoom in a little bit, and oh look, see, you can see that the quick selection would have deleted this section. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to hold Alt and just try to get this in. There we go. Let's get that little part there. I'm going to do the same for the side of the light. I'm going to hold Alt and just kind of brush the edges here, hoping that Photoshop will recognize these edges. Now when you do it first, it might not look like it's snapped, but as soon as you release the mouse button, it will try and find its way. There we go. There we go. All right. So let me zoom out now. All right, that should be it. Now, of course, if I hit delete, you can see that it will delete all of these areas here. Now, you could have used the polygonal lasso tool or even the magnetic lasso tool to highlight the areas around it. But I just wanted to show you the quick select tool because that's also a pretty good tool. All right, I'm going to right click and choose deselect, and I'm going to use my move tool. If you remember, that's that tool right here. And when I use the move tool, I'm able to resize. So I'm going to resize this now. All right. Now while I'm resizing this, I'm going to position it. And this is where your architectural skills come into play. Let me move this over here. You want to make sure that you get the size right. So you got to watch your scale. And the angle is a little off here, so I'm going to just a tad. Okay, let me put this a little over there. There we go. All right. And now here's the thing. Remember, we made the car smaller. So once we commit now, we have essentially crushed all of those pixels into a smaller space. So once we commit, those pixels that we have crushed are gone. So now would be a time to ensure that, you know, the car is okay. So I'm going to choose okay there. All right, good to go. Now let's look at some other tools that we have here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use the warp tool to kind of fix the perspective a bit. Now if you look closely, you will realize that, well, the car's perspective is kind of going this way, but the road is kind of going that way. So it kind of looks a little bit off, right? And this is where the perspective correction tools come in, which is great for architectural use, right? So to change that, perspective tool. Now you're gonna go to image. Well, make sure that the car is highlighted, because that is the layer that you want to actually warp. So once the car layer is highlighted, you're gonna go to edit, and you're gonna go down to transform, and you're gonna go down to warp. And what warp will do, it will change the box around it to these dots, and what you can do is actually drag these dots around. Now you have to kind of guesstimate where they would be in order for the perspective to roll out. And what I'm doing is actually clicking, holding, and dragging to get this car looking like it's on the road. There we go. All right, I'm gonna choose yes to commit. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to do a shadow, and we also want to do some reflections, right? So now the idea of let's do the shadow first. And what we can do to get the shadow, architecturally we know that the shadow would be somewhere in this section here, right? And that would be what the shadow would be like. Now we could actually try and draw in the shadow, but we're going to use some tools that Photoshop has available to us to get the shadows done. Now what we're going to do, our game plan is that we want to take this car, duplicate it. Alright, that's probably a horrible image of the car, but you get the idea. And then we want to color it black, and then place this black image of the car underneath the car so it looks like a shadow. So that's the plan that we want to do. So first thing we need to do is we need to make a copy of this car. Now to do that, we need, remember, this is the car layer here, and we need 2 copies of that car layer. Now to do that, what we do is we can right click, and then we can choose the option to duplicate layer. Now we want to name this layer car shadow. That's great. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, where is the car? And it's actually directly above the existing car, right? So if I use my move tool, make sure that is highlighted, and I'm on the car shadow layer, when I move, you will see that it has dragged out another car. Now we're going to use a technique called blending options to get this car to be filled black, right? Now to access your blending options on your layer, you're going to right click, you're going to say blending options, and you're going to wait for that window to pop up. Now once that window pops up, we're going to go to color overlay, and we're going to check that checkbox, and notice that once we check that checkbox, the car is actually now filled. We're going to click on it to highlight that color overlay to see the options. And what this layer style actually does is it really just allows you to fill that layer with a color, one flat color. So in this case, we want to fill it with black. We're going to choose OK. All right, now that's great. Now, of course, we want this to now act as a shadow, so we need to basically like squash it all the way down so that it's nice and flat like that. Now to do that, we're going to try out another tool. So we're going to go to edit, and then we're going to go down to let's go down to, we are going to go down to transform, and we're going to go to distort. Right, the last time we went to warp, but this time we're going to go to distort. And what this allows us to do is to grab these edges and actually distort the image in weird, funky ways. So what we want to do is to kind of distort the image like that, kind of like that, and like that. So now it's starting to look kind of like a car. Well, a bit. Let's carry this way. Let's carry this back. All right, now of course we need to commit this, so we want to make it look kind of like what we want, and then we're going to commit that. Now remember, once you commit it, you can't change it again, so you want to make sure you do that. And if you're not sure about it, then you want to use your history, and you want to go back up one step. Now of course the shadow layer needs to be below the car layer, naturally, because the shadow is below the car. So we're gonna carry that down. All right, great. So now the shadow is below the car, and next we perhaps want to make this very transparent, because right now it looks a bit too hard. And to do that, we're going to go to the opacity for the car shadow layer, and we're going to get the opacity all the way down to there. Okay, now this settings, we can always adjust that a little later. All right, it's coming there, but not quite yet. Next, what we want to do is we want to kind of blur this shadow a little bit. So to do that, we're going to go to filters. Now filters is an interesting element, set of options in Photoshop, and what we're going to do is start to explore what they do. Now filters really manipulate the pixels on screen to do various effects. Now in this case, we want to blur the shadow layer, so make sure the shadow layer is highlighted, the car shadow layer, and we're going to go to filter, we're going to go to blur, and we're going to try out, let's try a Gaussian blur. And what that is it's actually using this slider bar here to adjust whatever layer we currently have selected. And what it is doing is that it's making it more blurry, right? So the more we increase this slider bar here, is the more blurry that shadow becomes. It's almost gone now, so let's carry it back a bit. Yeah, there we go. So it's an overcast day, so we don't have a nice hard shadow, so that is fine. So we're going to choose OK. All right, so now we have a shadow. So that's without the shadow, and this is with the shadow. So the shadow definitely helps to ground it. Next, we want to have the reflection, and guess what? We're going to use the same approach. We're going to take the car, flip it upside down, and that will be the reflection. So we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to take the car layer, and we're going to right click and choose duplicate, and we're going to call this reflection. All right, so again, if I'm on the reflection layer and I drag this out, you will see that it's copied. Now in this case, what we want to do is actually mirror the car upside down. And to do that, all we need to do is to, I call it over squash, but we need to like squash this down. And if you're using the new version of Photoshop, you need to hold shift in order to squash. Hold shift while you are trying to resize. And we're gonna go all the way down until we come on the other side, and voila, we have a copy that is flipped. Now the trick with this now is if we put it in position, it's not gonna quite fit. So what we need to do, let's commit that change. We need to perhaps use the warp tool. So we're gonna go to edit and transform and go to the warp option. And with that selected, what we want to do is kind of warp this so that only the tires will touch. So that's the tricky part of this. What you want is the tires to touch. There we go. All right, we're going to commit that. And then of course, we're going to put this reflection layer below the shadow layer. Let's put it below the shadow layer. That's much better. And then we're going to make the reflection layer, we're going to let the opacity be lower, just like the shadow layer. So we're going to adjust that down. There we go. And we want to get it ever so slightly. All right. So basically, this is where we're at now. All right, so we can see the reflection. Now what we want to do just for kicks is that we want to add a little bit of motion blur to the car to let it look like it's driving, you know, really fast, you know. And to do that, we're going to use yet another filter. So what we're going to do is we could add a motion blur to this car. Let's try and see if that works. So we're going to select the car and we're going to go to filter, blur, and we're going to go to, this time we are going to choose motion blur. Now we're going to get presented with options once again, and you can kind of see now that the entire car is blurred, and the blurriness is really controlled by that. And the angle, you can kind of see the car is being blurred at an angle that is controlled here. So what we're going to do is we can try to increase this. Nah, we can also try to change the angle. I mean, this is kind of okay, but what happened is that the entire car is perhaps too blurred, so I'm going to cancel that. What we can do is we're going to use the same trick again. We're going to duplicate the car layer. So to do that, we're going to right click and we're going to choose duplicate, and we're going to call this car blur motion. And yet again, this is another copy, but this time we will add the blur to this layer. So we're going to add the blur and we're going to choose motion blur. Now of course this time it's added to this object here, but that's fine because we're not using this. And we can actually just put this object directly over this object. Then what we're going to do is we're going to use a new tool that we very popular, but we haven't used it to the current time, which is the eraser tool, which is that tool right there. So we're going to pick the eraser tool, and what we're going to do is Well, remember how this works. So the options for the eraser tools are located up top. Remember, any button you select here, the options for that button is located up top. And what we want to do with this eraser tool here is let the size of the brush be big. So we're going to pick the size and we're going to make that big, even more big, maybe a tad more. Whoa, no, that's too big. All right, great. Next, we perhaps want to change the flow, which is basically the strength of the eraser. So we're going to empty that all the way down to maybe like 10. And then what we're going to do is we are going to erase half of the car. So let's use that eraser tool here, and what we're actually erasing is the car blur layer, and under it is the car layer, so it kind of gives the impression that it's moving. All right, so when you're all done, this is what your image should look like. So good luck and have fun.